Hello and welcome to the April Arvos of Harvo. It is only just a little bit very late. I did get really sick over April, and when I get sick I can't really read because I'm not going to work, so I'm not taking the train, and I just don't have the concentration to kind of sit there and focus on something. Like, I get distracted so easily. So I don't have very much to talk about, and this is going to be hopefully a shorter episode. There are some books that I want to go on big tangents on, and I'm going to resist that for the sake of my voice. So let's get started. Okay, so there's 3 books here and one that I read on the Kindle, and that makes only 4, which I think is the fewest in a very long time that I've read so far. But I have some thoughts about all of these. So first of all, I was supposed to finish this series in April, and I just didn't get around to it. I only read the second one, which is Subtle Knife. This is the second book in the Northern Lights trilogy. What is it called? The His Dark Materials trilogy. And this is young adult fantasy. It is... I like to think of it as the kind of atheist counterparts to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, because a lot of that series was based on Christian theology, and this one is quite negative towards organized religion. One of the main things about all the recurring themes of this novel is how you can't really trust institutions, whether it is churches or universities or anything, right? A lot of it has to do with finding your own wisdom, making your own way through the world, having a robust set of personal values as opposed to following some kind of preordained history or mythology or value system. And so we follow these 2 young characters. In Northern Lights, it was a alternate reality, an alternate world where everyone had their own demon familiar, and it was a kind of like weird steampunky, sort of clockworky kind of society, which was really interesting. And well, spoilers-ish, that novel revealed that there's a bunch of multiverses, and this novel is now set in our ostensibly real world. We follow a young boy named Will, whose family is kind of in poor circumstances, and he finds himself traveling between these worlds. They spend a lot of time in this middle interstitial world where only children survive because there are phantoms that fly around and steal the souls of all the adults. But that world is kind of like a crossroads or a terminus world between Lyra's fantasy steampunk time and Will's normal human time. And they kind of jump back and forth between these. They personally try to discover what it is that leads these kind of multiverses, what that means for society and for reality. And it's getting a bit edgy, this book. I feel like the original... the first Northern Lights of the Golden Compass was very adventurous, it was very coming of age. The fantasy world really helped it as well, whereas in The Subtle Knife, because it is set in the real world, and it is still about teenagers, it's just a little bit more angsty. It's that whole, like, we don't trust adults, and we don't want to, like, we don't need no education. It's like the standard rebellious kid kind of story, and I just didn't enjoy it quite as much as Northern Lights. The other thing about Northern Lights too is that it's such a unique fantasy world. It doesn't really draw upon any mythologies or any existing, myths and legends and stuff. It just tries to make something brand new. And while that does kind of continue in the Subtle Knife, it's just not as pronounced because it does have that real world thing to it. Now, the 3rd book in the series, The Amber Spyglass, is double the length of this. It's really long, and so I didn't get around to it, but hopefully I'll try to finish that this year. I would give this middle book, The Subtle Knife, a 3 out of 5. Like, I'm interested to see how it concludes, and I'm interested to see how they reconcile the whole multiverse thing, because they've now upped the stakes a huge amount with this book. But aside from the kind of very standard quest narrative that happens here, I don't know, it doesn't really pull me. It doesn't do as much as the first novel in the series did. Book number 2 is True History of the Kelly Gang by Peter Carey. And Peter Carey, one of the most famous international exports of the Australian writers, one of the few Australian writers that is winning international prizes, and this is the one that won the Booker. So I have very mixed thoughts about this. Very briefly summarizing what this is a historical fiction, kind of found footage representation of Ned Kelly, who was a very famous Australian career criminal. And this is set in the 1800s, where it's still the conflict between the landowners and the descendants of convicts and the lower class migrants that came to Australia in this really rural area where it's easy to hide and it's easy to run from the law. and the police very much feel like a separate faction to both of these groups. So the police can be negotiated with and can be manipulated and can be used as kind of like a chess piece in this larger conflict. So they can make alliances with some police, or they can make enemies with some specific police. The police are often mobilized and used by the ruling class, the affluent class, to try and protect their assets rather than try to keep any kind of peace and quiet. It's definitely making a commentary on this, and to that extent I find it's quite prescient, the way that it looks at the lawlessness and the very grey morality of the time, and especially the way that it treats its police characters I found quite interesting, because these are not characters that represent any kind of enforcement of the law. Instead, they are heightened in their power because they can imprison people and they have like guns and stuff, but they also are just one piece of a very large ongoing conflict that happens here, and that to me is quite interesting. But aside from that, I just don't find the story of Ned Kelly particularly interesting, and I don't know if this is something that's shared between Australians compared to the way this novel is received around the world, because I think that every culture has its folk heroes, and different countries and different cultures have their own relationships to those cult heroes. So last month when I read Lincoln the Bardo, Abraham Lincoln is such a cult figure in America. I mean, very famously did a lot of great things, but people respect Lincoln. People put bumper stickers in their cars for Lincoln and portraits of Lincoln in their homes. Maybe they don't do that, but they revere Lincoln, right? They look at Lincoln and they admire him as a figure. And in Australia, we don't really have that kind of attitude to anybody. I don't think that there's really any one Australian folk hero that we look upon positively. And the closest that we would really get is Ned Kelly, but I can't think of anybody who reveres Ned Kelly or thinks very highly of Ned Kelly or identifies with Ned Kelly. And after reading this novel, I feel the same way. Like, even though the novel is trying to make Ned Kelly a folk hero and pushing up the kinds of values that he stood for as a particularly Australian quality, I just don't feel it. And I still felt really silly reading this on the train because no one cares about Ned Kelly. Like, we all kind of know who he is, and implicitly the values that he stands for, the personal freedoms and the personal justice that he stands for in opposition to corrupt police, and that whole underdog story, it's very Australian, and it's very embedded into who we are and what our culture is like in our day-to-day. But we don't need Ned Kelly to represent this, and it just feels very strange to read this. And looking at the way that it functions as a historical fiction work as well, a lot of work has been done to make this feel believably like something that was written by Ned Kelly himself. So it's diaries and it's newspaper articles, and it's... I think the critics said that he doesn't use a single comma in the entire novel. Like, it's just this big, very scratchy, slapped together style of writing, and it makes it quite hard to interpret because you're just trying to figure out what he's trying to say, and it's just so different to the way that a general invisible style of prose would do it. I just don't feel like it's necessary. I feel like it's successful. It definitely does make me believe to an extent that this is something written by the character, but I don't know if it was really necessary for me to be pulled into the story or to really enjoy the story, especially given that a lot of historical alterations are made to make the narrative work better, and I don't know if they were fully necessary. So one of the big things the novel does is it gives Ned Kelly a love interest and a mother that he's fighting for and protecting. And historically, don't think either of those figures were really a big part of him. And I think that makes this novel less interesting, because if we give Ned Kelly, this career criminal, I don't want to say Freudian, because that's not what it is, but like a default excuse, right? Like, he's protecting the innocent. It makes him less interesting as a moral character, rather than if we just kept him as a criminal and just said, he's motivated by money. He's motivated by riches and power, but he's still a worthwhile figure to study because the people trying to apprehend him are also corrupt. Like, I find that kind of story more interesting than this, he's the good guy and those guys are the bad guys, and he's done some bad stuff, but we generally forgive him. Like, I find that just not as interesting. And lastly, too, I did find it kind of funny the way that it underplays the nature of the gang as well. So it makes Ned Kelly more of an ordinary figure, and it takes away a lot of the mythologization that happened with the Kelly gang. Yes, they were very well known as criminals, and yes, they did pull off a lot of robberies and a lot of heists, and very famously towards the ends of their career, they did the whole tin armor thing, standoff against the police. A lot of that, we see all that here, and it all happens, but it's downplayed to the sense that it's not very organized, and it's not very historic, it's not very cinematic. It's more just a case of this is kind of how it played out. Just one thing led to another, people were around, and that's just kind of how it happened. And I do like that. I do like how it makes this kind of story seem like it came out of an ordinary community and ordinary people, rather than he was born to be this great figure. I think that makes more sense. But aside from that, I just don't gel with it. I don't enjoy it. I don't know why it was necessary for me, an Australian, to read this. I wonder how it was taken internationally, because I can imagine people reading in America or in the UK, they wouldn't know who Ned Kelly really is. And so learning about this figure in this way might be more interesting to them. I don't know. I don't really know. I give it a 2 out of 5. I think that if you did any lessons about Ned Kelly in primary school in Australia, you probably don't really need to read this. So my Make Me Laugh of April is Fried Green Tomatoes, The Whistle Stop Cafe. I cannot say this title properly. It's okay. It's alright. I'm really surprised at how well this book did and sold when it first came out, and I wonder if it was because the American South narrative wasn't as common until this one came out. But now thinking about it, like, I can think of so many novels that are set in the American South and have that sense of community going on there, to the point where I don't see something particularly special about this one. I find the characters in this novel to be quite familiar in a negative way, as in, like, I've kind of seen them before. So we mainly follow a woman named Iggy, who is this kind of like tomboy figure. She runs a cafe that's on the train tracks called the Whistle Stop Cafe, and she employs a few African American chefs. She gives food to homeless people that are traveling on the trains, and she has a dark family history backstory, whatever. And it's just, it's a slow and meandering kind of book. It does have a core narrative arc, but I wouldn't necessarily say that arc is the main part of it. So Iggy does fall in love with a woman named Ruth, who's living with her, and the main arc of the story is about how Ruth ends up getting married to another man, and that man is very cruel to her, and Iggy takes matters into her own hands to try and get Ruth back. And over the course of the novel, we kind of see how this all plays out, because it is non-linear in a genuinely bizarre kind of way. So this book has 4 timelines. I'm gonna just dial back here and say that this is a light novel that I feel like was written to be enjoyed at book clubs over tea and crumpets, like just very breezy intentions. Because it's not thematically deep, it's not complex in terms of its language, it doesn't really need a lot of work or effort to chew through, or at least doesn't feel like it was supposed to. It's meant to be breezy reading. I'll put that thought in a box to the side, because the actual construction of this novel is stupidly complex. It has 4 timelines where each one whips back and forth every 3 or 4 pages, and they don't connect together until midway through the novel. So as you're reading through the opening, you're just getting used to the fact that you're constantly switching between these characters and constantly going between the 1910s, the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1960s, and then the 1980s. And it's not even linear. It's just stories told from so many different angles. We have just plain narration of Iggy in the 1920s. We have a dialogue between another member of her family and another woman in a nursing home in the 1980s. We have news articles from the Whistle Stop that just exist throughout this whole time. And we have other chapters from the perspective of other characters just interspersed here and there. And so it's really, I found it really hard to get my head around, just because every couple of pages I had to figure out, well, where am I now and what's happening now? And only midway through the novel do these all sync together and we start hearing the same story from these four perspectives. Otherwise, we are just learning about new people all the time. And because it is a Southern United States novel too, it does lead into the whole big family situation. So there's lots of characters to know at the very beginning. I was just exhausted the entire time. I was so tired. And I also don't like the way that it plays the whole vigilante justice in a small town trope completely straight. It's because it does do that, and it never really interrogates it, even though it does depict how dark it can be to be in that situation where you are in this small town and you're beset by rumors and no one's really going to help you if anything bad is happening to you. So all you can do is take matters into your own hands and perpetuate the kinds of violence that exist in this environment. It does go there, but it doesn't say anything about it other than, well, this is how it is, and we like Iggy, and screw you, God's mine, right? Like, I just don't like that kind of ending. And I just don't like that kind of ending. And I wish that it did more with it, but it just didn't. So I would give it a 2 out of 5. So I've got one last book. I'm going to use this as a placeholder. A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle. I actually don't know how to pronounce the last name. A Wrinkle in Time. This is one of the, I think, middle grade or not even young adult, just children's novels that I'd never encountered when I was younger. And I'd only really known about it based on teachers who would assign it for their classes. And most of those teachers seemed to enjoy the novel. Most of their students seemed to enjoy the novel. So I came to think and respect this novel. I came to think of it as something that was elevated above other novels of this type, because I personally, this is probably one of the most controversial opinions I have. I personally don't really care for Roald Dahl. I don't really care for a lot of children's novels aimed towards that age, especially the ones that are considered classics nowadays. I didn't care for The Wind in the Willows. I don't particularly care for any of the Roald Dahl works. I don't particularly care for Enid Blyton. I'm just gonna make so many enemies here. I just don't think that a lot of those classics have aged well. I think that their sense of morality and storytelling is more one-dimensional than it needs to be for younger audiences. I think that children can handle a lot more complexity when it comes to emotions, when it comes to conflicts, when it comes to how stories relate to their own lives. And I just think that the very one-note storytelling of these people are good and these people are bad and destroy the bad people and the good people win, I find that quite damaging to young readers, because I think it presents to them an oversimplified view of things. And so if we look at A Wrinkle in Time, the thing I do like about A Wrinkle in Time is that it does sidestep this. So it is not a book that is so simply about a big bad evil thing that needs to be destroyed. Or is it? It sort of is, but it's more than that, because we follow a young girl who is not. Well, one of the things we learn about her immediately is that she doesn't fit well into the school system. She is intelligent, but she does not work well in a classroom, and so her teachers often give her bad marks, although her parents are very, very intelligent, and they admire and support the kind of curiosity that she has. And so she has a good relationship with her younger brother, who very similarly is gifted and intelligent, but not in the same way that schools would reward them. So both of them find themselves as kind of outcast figures. And at the beginning of the story, we get three mysterious characters who arrive at the door. So Mrs. Who, Mrs. Whatsit, and Mrs. something else. I hate that the characters' names are deliberately made for me to forget them. But three Mrs. W's. And they reveal that the parents have researched into time travel. And so they jump all the way through different time periods and historical periods in order to try and address this dark presence force that's taking over people. And it's weirdly complicated. I feel like the way they describe time travel is more complicated than some adult sci-fi works that I've read. They really do talk through the way it works. And the way that they go to different locations too. I feel like they could have spent more time on it. And I feel like they could have really jazzed up the way that different historical periods looked. But ultimately, that's not the main point of the novel. The point of the novel is not time travel for fun. The point of the novel is this multi-dimensional quest to save your family. It feels to me very Spirited Away like. It's that first responsibility that's given to our young narrator, and it's something that is way beyond her depth and requires a lot of emotional maturity out of her. And for that extent, I think for that age group, I like it. I like what it's trying to do. I like the complexity that it has. I like the way that the morality of the book is not so straightforward. And I like the way that it uses these various characters who are very good at some things and very bad at some other things. The way that it shows how they can work together to achieve what they want to do. For the most part, I like it. I think that it's a bit dense and indulgent sometimes in the way that it describes science, the way it describes just odd, specific things that happen. I can't really remember one off the top of my head. I just remember feeling that sometimes, that the momentum of the plot sometimes would stop in order to have an explanation and then move on to something else. It wasn't a huge deal because ultimately it's a very short novel. I think I finished it in 2 days, but it did chug along at those moments. But out of the grand scheme of kids' books, whilst I do respect it a little bit more, I don't think it maintains that status in my head of one of the best children's books. Because whilst I can imagine younger readers enjoying it, there's just other things I would suggest. Like, I think The Little Prince does similar things to A Wrinkle in Time, but it manages to be both more complex and more appropriate for a younger age group as well. I would recommend The Little Prince to all kinds of age groups, because no matter how old you are, you would pick up something out of it. And A Wrinkle in Time does sort of do that as well, but I don't necessarily feel like as an adult you would need to go back to it. I wouldn't suggest that it's that significant, so I would give it a 3 out of 5. Okay, those are my books of April. A very small amount of reading this time, and for May it's going to be very similar because my illness just went all the way through. It's kind of nice, actually, to be a bit shorter about this, and to slow down and not worry so much about numbers. I don't agree with that at all. I want to read more. I want to have bigger numbers, make the numbers bigger. Once I'll have a normal month, and I will finally get through a lot more things and talk about more things. But thank you for joining. I will see you next time.